Hi everyone, I think we'll get started. Thank you all for joining us today. For those who were here yesterday or the day before, and also any new people we have today. Apologies to anyone who has been at the other meetings, because there probably will be a little bit of repetition in the introduction. So this is the third session in our first Common Home, Common Ground webinar mini-series. The four-part Is the Media Failing Us on Climate Change? I'm Georgina, I work at Hope for the Future as the Media Outreach Officer, and I'm joined by Emma, who is our Events Officer, and Georgia, our Communications Officer. As you know, today we'll be discussing how decision makers and the media can interact to communicate climate change effectively. Hope for the Future is a climate charity which works to equip communities, groups and individuals across the country to communicate the urgency of climate change with their local politicians. So we can support you to engage with your elected representatives, and please do get in touch with us if that's something that you're interested in. This webinar is part of Hope for the Future's Press Here for Change project, which works to connect decision makers with local media in order to report on the challenges and opportunities of green issues in ways that is relevant to people's lives. We feel it's vitally important for communities around the UK that MPs and constituents have rich and challenging conversations about the climate crisis. Local grassroots democratic engagement is essential if we are hoping to transition to a greener society equitably. Local media can be a powerful tool to drive this community engagement. And over the 4 webinars this week, we're hoping to explore these issues in greater detail. So the purpose of these webinars is to create a space where people can come together and have climate conversations from home, reflecting on how we can ensure that local democracy is built on green principles. We're exploring all of Hope for the Future's project areas throughout the Common Home, Common Ground series. This week, media, then MP engagement, young families, youth and faith. You can register for free for any of the other series on Eventbrite. We'll be sending that in a follow-up email after the last session tomorrow. We'd like to thank the European Climate Foundation and Gower Street for funding both our media and events projects, which have allowed us to put on these webinars. So before I get started, just going to go over some housekeeping again. Firstly, we'll be recording the webinar, so it'll be available on demand for you to watch again and share. It will be up on YouTube probably either this evening or tomorrow afternoon. We'll send attendees a follow-up email directing you to Hope for the Future's latest resources, our Eventbrite page and anything else relevant after the last session on Thursday. For timings, we're going to have 25 to 30 minutes for our speaker and then 25 to 30 minutes for questions. So we should be wrapped up by around 3. We want to hear all your questions, so please put them in the Q&A box throughout the webinar, and we'll cover them in the question section at the end. You also have the power to upvote questions. So if someone has asked a question that you would like to see answered, if you click the thumbs up icon, it can be upvoted and it will draw our attention to it. You can also get involved by following us on social media and hashtagging HFTF webinar or Common Home. You should be able to see a chat box as well, where you can speak to the other webinar attendees throughout, but please do post your questions in the Q&A box rather than the chat box, if possible. At the end of the webinar, a feedback form will appear. We had some technical difficulties with it yesterday, but it should be there today. Please take a couple of minutes to fill it out, because it's really useful for us to have your feedback when we do things like this in future. As said previously, I'll be hosting. Emma's going to be monitoring questions, and Georgia is on tech support. So if you're having any issues, please put them in the chat box and she'll be able to help you out. So without further ado, I'm delighted to introduce our panelist for today, Leo Barasi. He's covering the topic, how decision makers and the media can interact to communicate climate change effectively. So Leo is a writer and analyst on public opinion and climate change. His 2017 book, The Climate Majority, looks at why public opinion about climate change matters, why so many people are apathetic about the problem, and what can overcome this apathy. He regularly writes about the subject, including for The Guardian, New Statesman, and Prospect, and he advises scientific and campaign groups on how they can influence governments and the public to support stronger action to limit carbon emissions. So now I'm going to hand over to Leo. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Hi, Thanks, everyone. It's really great to see so many people here. I'm totally unable to multitask, so I'm just going to stop speaking for a second while I attempt to share my screen. Good, that hopefully has worked seamlessly. So I'm going to talk about decision makers, media and climate change. And I guess I was sort of reflecting on what that means with those groups. And I think essentially this is about public debate and how the public debate about climate change influences, restricts or enables some of the important decisions that have to be made in the very near future about our emissions. And when I say our, in this case, I guess I'm particularly thinking about the UK, but a lot of what I'm going to talk about is relevant for a lot of other countries who need to be making important decisions about their emissions. So before I dive in, I guess I think there's a challenge that is really important here, and we shouldn't take for granted this question of why it matters what the media says, and more broadly what the public debate is about climate change. And I think there's a reason to think we shouldn't assume it's important. If you look back at something that might seem obscure, but I think is interesting, about, what is it now, about 14, 15 years ago, the European Parliament passed these wide-ranging rules regulating the manufacture and supply of chemicals in the EU. And they were passed with little public debate or media coverage, but they became a fact of life for businesses and individuals and imposed a huge cost on business activity, about £500 million a year, and it's hoped will save many lives. But as I say, it happened with very little debate. And so for most people, it became part of their lives without them realizing it was happening. Now, it occurs to me, if you can do that when it without really much media engagement, can you do the same when it comes to climate change? Can the world tackle that threat without media attention, without public debate? And if that's the case, then perhaps we don't need to be talking about it. So I think the answer is no, and I think we do public debate, media coverage does matter, and I'll just talk for a minute or two about why I think that is. So the first thing just to be really clear about is the decisions that the world is going to make over the next few years are going to shape what the planet looks like and the experience of people living on the planet for centuries and in fact millennia to come. There's a astonishingly wide range of consequences depending on what happens now. If emissions are tightly controlled, then the world's path will be like the dark blue line at the bottom. So another half a degree or so of warming compared with what we've had now. If emissions aren't controlled, then by the end of this century, certainly within the lifetime of children who are alive now, then the world will warm another 3 degrees. It'll carry on warming, and the consequences of that will be truly catastrophic. And that is going to be the consequences of things that happen now, that policymakers who are in power now and policymakers who will be in power in the next 10 years, 15 years, are going to be the ones who really shape which of these lines we take. Obviously, decisions will continue to matter, but really decisions now can have an enormously wide range of different consequences. And just to be clear about what that red line at the top means, by the end of this century, with high emissions, we would see about 1 meter of sea level rise. So coastal cities like Kolkata, Shanghai, Miami, Tokyo, New York even, would be either very regularly flooded or inundated. A paper that came out a couple of weeks ago found 1 in 3 people would be living in places as hot as the hottest part of the Sahara. Again, if emissions continue to rise. And that will obviously not only have enormous human and social consequences, but direct consequences for our food supply. Now, all of these are things that will happen if emissions fall to some extent. But if emissions keep rising, then they will happen much more severely, much more frequently, and the consequences would be much more important. So there are really significant consequences of decisions that are being made soon. So we need to be on that bottom line, the dark blue line. And how do we get there? Well, this is where I come back to the media and public debate. And I think we have to be confronted with how hard it is to get there. So this chart shows what's happened to carbon emissions over the last 45, 50 years or so in the dark line, and what they would need to do if the world is to restrict warming sharply. Essentially, after decades of steady growth, emissions need to rapidly fall to the point where within about 30, 35 years, they need to have reached zero overall emissions. So any emissions that are released need to be balanced by other activities, and then they need to fall further than that, so the world is absorbing more emissions than it's releasing. So there is, by the middle of the century, very, very little space for continued emissions. And that means doing a lot of things that come close to public life. So I've selected here a few of the things that the world will need to do, and countries like the UK will need to do to cut emissions to that point, and arrange them broadly in terms of how challenging they are with the public debate and public opinion. So on the left, we have things like electricity, industry, shipping, where in terms of cutting emissions, they're things that either the public broadly don't notice or quite like. So they're technically challenging, sure, but in terms of the public debate, there isn't that much of a problem. But as we go further along and we get to things like home heating, flying, and particularly the food and drink we consume, addressing those emissions isn't really something that can be done without the public noticing. These are things where a public debate, where there has to be public support. The media have to be an important part of it, and a constructive part of it. And without those, it's really challenging to see how the UK and other countries can eliminate emissions as far as is needed in the next few decades. So that's why I think public debate matters. And I'm going to talk for a bit about where the public is at the moment, and then sort of think about what that means for the debate and for the media and decision makers. So on the face of it, people in the UK are worried about climate change. The overwhelming majority say that they're at least fairly concerned. Many people now say they're very concerned about climate change. And a similar proportion say that they like onshore wind, which might come as a surprise to some people because there's a very strong sense that wind turbines are unpopular. But actually, most people say that they like them. In fact, other polls show that people like them even when they are situated close to their homes. And conversely, very few people say that they support perhaps the currently most iconic dirty form of energy, shale gas fracking. So there's clearly explicit rhetorical support for tackling climate change and for clean energy in opposition to dirty energy. But when you ask people, would you personally be willing to pay more for these wind turbines that you say you support, then attitudes shift very quickly. So from 80% saying they support onshore wind, we get down to only 18% saying that they would personally pay more for these wind farms. And it's this drop-off that I think we need to be particularly careful of and to pay the most attention to. And that's where I think the part of the public debate faces the most challenge, but I think where there absolutely are things that those of us who are concerned about this can make progress. That drop off from 80% down to 18%. So where's that coming from and what's going on in public opinion? The best evidence for this is still in the US, and what I'm showing you now comes from US research, although there is actually helpfully some new UK research coming very soon that I think will shed a lot more light on this. But for now, this is from Yale University. And what they've done is they've broken the US public down into 6 groups who they've arranged here from the people who are most worried about climate change, the alarmed, over to people who are least worried, the dismissive. And essentially, I've got to say, I find that those 6 groups are a little difficult to get my head around. So I found it easier simply to think of them as about 18% who are very worried about climate change, a similar number who are very opposed to climate action, and then by far the largest group, more than half, about 60%, who are there in the middle, who are neither the strongly concerned nor the strongly opposing of action. And those are the groups that I have in mind when I think about the public debate and thinking about how they can be influenced. So what do they think? Well, the concerned, they are people who say things like, I get that it's happening, it's serious, but we should prioritize things like housing and the health service, or it's not that I don't think it's important, I just don't think it's going to have that much impact on our lives and our generation. And then moving along to the next group, the cautious, they essentially say they just don't think about it very much. And I think the really crucial one is this one at the bottom. I often see targets I don't really understand. I'm skeptical when I hear of things such as flight taxes, which I worry won't achieve anything. So in these 2 groups, we have people who are clear that climate change is real, are clear that it's a threat, but when they compare it to other issues, they don't prioritize it and they don't think about it much. And so when a politician comes along and proposes some measure that will be one of those ones that are at that end of the scale that come closer to their lives, they haven't really been thinking about it much. They haven't really been engaging with it. And so they just don't understand what the point of this is, why they should be making this, this sacrifice in their lives, why they should be taking on an additional cost for this thing that they're skeptical is going to make a difference, and they're not sure the point. And I think that is where we're stuck at with this challenge at the moment. Now, just before I go on to why that is and what can be done about that, I do just want to say that over the last 18 months or so, concern about climate change has very clearly increased. This is showing the ranking of the environment as a priority issue for the UK public. So typically it's been, for many years, it was about the 9th to the 11th most important issue. And you could really see that in the last year and a half, now this is pre-COVID, but I think in terms of its ranking, it hasn't changed much. It is now up to 4th, and I think in some polls up to 3rd, essentially level with as an issue that people say should be a priority for the country. We see similar in Australia. The dark blue line shows the proportion of people who say global warming is serious and pressing. Clearly it dipped very significantly in the late noughties, but it's now back at the level it was before then. It's been steadily rising for a few years. And in the US, look at the dark line in the middle, that's the general public. And not a dramatic increase, but a very steady one from about 50% a few years ago who say they're worried about climate change to 66%. So there is absolutely this large group in the middle still who are worried about climate change, but don't think about it much. But overall opinion has been moving in the right direction. Nevertheless, we have these people who think this, who get that climate change is real, and just don't doubt the science, but yet don't think about it much. And I think for understanding what needs to happen to public debate, we need to understand why this is a bit. Psychologists have done quite a lot of work on this, and what they say is essentially climate change is a problem that is really poorly suited for the human mind. Climate change seems to progress quite slowly, doesn't seem to change that much from year to year, certainly not month to month. It mostly seems to happen to other people and mostly seems to happen in other places. And what they say is the human brain hasn't evolved to deal with threats like that, these things that seem distant and slow moving. This was really nicely put by a professor of psychology at Harvard University, Daniel Gilbert, who said that the human brain is essentially a get out of the way machine. You could be president of the US and really good at dodging a shoe that's thrown at your face, but not be able to take climate change seriously. And I don't think that there's anything wrong in all of that, but for me, the psychologists are missing a point. And the point that they're missing is that all these ways that I've just talked about climate change, it's not some immutable fact. It's not something inevitable in the nature of climate change. It's the consequences of choices that have been made about how it's talked about. And in many respects, those choices could be changed and weren't inevitable. And I'm going to give a couple of examples of how that plays out. So the first is if we think about the experience of what climate change means. If you do a Google image search for climate change, not scientific, but I think very telling, the first 30 results give you 5 icebergs, 3 sad polar bears, and only 2 people and not a single flooded home. So for reasons that I think made sense to them at the time, the groups that have done much of the talking about climate change, particularly as it became a publicly known issue, chose to talk about things that are very distant from most people's experience and things that matter to most people. And I think there's a really stark comparison with what we've seen over the last few months, that you can see how climate change might have seemed like something that is a distant threat. And now we've experienced something that no one can see as a distant threat, that is an experience that is very clearly present in people's lives, that is obviously here and now. And I think the emotional experience that many more people have had to the pandemic compared with climate change has, I think, been very striking. And this for me has been one of the major factors. So a second challenge is this sense that climate change is, or that tackling climate change is something that plays into this desire that is absolutely universal, not to be advantage of, not to be a sucker. And this relates to the way that the human mind tends to reason backwards, or often reasons backwards. If we don't like the solution to a problem, then unconsciously we decide that the problem can't be that serious in the first place, and vice versa. If you look at what Donald Trump said when he announced that the US was going to pull out of the Paris Climate Agreement, he didn't say it was because climate change was a hoax. He repeatedly said it's because the Paris Agreement is unfair to the US. And he's always been very careful to frame the problem, his opposition to climate change policy, as being about the measures taken to deal with it. And it's very smartly seen that the sense of being taken as a sucker is a really strong motivator for people to think that the problem can't be that important then. And again, there's a really clear comparison to what we're seeing at the moment. The social consensus that built up around lockdown, I think, was really powerfully driven by people seeing that other people were also behaving well, and seeing the empty streets was a really powerful motivator. That it's not possible for this to be dealt with by some people doing the hard work and other people taking advantage of it. And actually the flip is just potentially beginning to happen now, the sense that people's neighbours are having parties in their back garden, or some people are going on holiday or having fun in the park. That is when the social consensus here breaks down, because again, we feel that we're being taken for a sucker. So that's where we are at the moment. And I'm going to finish now by talking about a few things that I think those of us who want to change this can do to tackle the threat. And just to start off, I want to tackle directly this question of where the media is on it at the moment. I saw this question at the start about, is this about national or local media? So here I'm just talking about national, and apologies, I don't have the data for local. But I think those of us who are extremely alarmed about climate change have long felt that it isn't covered sufficiently by the media. Sorry, sufficiently is what I'm saying here. And that we might still argue that that's the case, but I think our concern that issue really should be lessened now. This is from University of Colorado, who do really nice monitoring of the extent to which climate change is mentioned in media globally. And before the pandemic, we were running at a level of about 1,500 mentions of climate change a month in the UK's newspapers. So this isn't including the BBC, which has also hugely increased its climate coverage. So that, I hope my maths is right here, that's about 50 articles a day across 7 newspapers. So several articles in each newspaper every day about climate change. Now, most of that is driven by the Times, the Sunday Times, the Guardian, and the Observer. But actually, if you squint in on the lower lines, you can see that actually the rest of the media has significantly increased its coverage as well. The Mirror was running at about the same level towards the end of last year as the Guardian had been for most of the previous years. So in terms of volume of coverage, sure, I'd like it to be more, but it has now reached a level where there is significant number of climate change stories every day in the UK media. But what are those stories about, and how can that be changed? I think I talked about the distance effect at a time when this year we saw Australia on fire. Last year, much of the US was on fire. China has had very serious floods. India had heat waves. Europe, many European countries set their hottest ever days last summer. And Greece obviously had devastating fires very recently. We're very clearly at a time where climate change is visible. It's happening now, and seeing the effects of climate change. And those effects are being felt in the countries where emissions need to fall. There seems to be no argument anymore that climate change should be talked about as something that is primarily for polar bears or primarily for the Arctic. This isn't some obscure thing that could only be seen by scientists with delicate instruments. It's absolutely something that is visible in the lives of people who are living in those high emitting countries. And for me, that's really the prime reason why the school strikers have been such an important part of the debate. Having a large number of people who are not motivated because of their careers or because they're being paid to do so or because they're typical green activists, saying that they are personally alarmed about what climate change means for them has been a really important driver for the debate in the countries where it's happened, of showing that this is something that is a direct threat to to people in our countries. And I think the more that those school strikes can continue after lockdown, then I think the more that threat will be part of the debate. On the other hand, the sense that this is a looming disaster on its own is probably unhelpful. It's also important to be clear that the world can tackle this. This is from the signing of the Paris Agreement in 2015, when the world committed to limiting warming to within reasonably safe levels. And the world knows how to do this. The science and technology is largely clear. Countries have plans for how to do this, and many, including the UK, have set laws to do it. Now, obviously, setting those targets isn't the same as delivering it, but it is achievable, and countries have said that they're going to do it. And I think this is something that is often lost in the debate. I talked about the sucker effect, and I talked about China, and that is to debate to an extent, but I think it is beginning to fade from the debate, rightly, because countries like China and India are becoming much better with their emissions reductions. In some respects, they're climate leaders internationally. They still have some way to go, particularly China, but the international comparison is less of a threat than it had been. But where there is a real challenge, and I think this is probably the single most important thing for policymakers to be doing, that they're not doing at the moment, and to be communicating through the media, is talking about how it's being done fairly at home. We saw in France the consequences of the government raising fuel duty and the eruption of protests that came from the Gilets jaunes when that happened, and how long running those were. If there is a sense that climate change is being tackled on the backs of the poor, on the backs of the squeezed middle, perhaps, then there's a real threat that there won't be social consensus that this is happening. So sure, talk about the problem, talk about the fact that it can be tackled, but what I think is still overwhelmingly missing, at least in the public mind, it certainly exists in the policy and think tank world, but I think the public can't see this yet, is a sense that this can be tackled fairly. And I think the transparency that would be required to convince people about this hasn't been there. And whenever people's lives are influenced, then this is the threat that I think needs to be on decision makers' minds. And when they're working through the media, that needs to be there. Now, I said threat and burden and so on a few times there. And also, we need to be clear that there are a lot of other benefits to acting besides just stopping catastrophic climate change, just being an important word in that sentence. If the world closes down every coal power station, something like 1 million lives a year will be saved from the air pollution. Many of us are experiencing right now the benefits we get from cleaner air when we don't have anything like as many internal combustion engines driving around outside our homes. Getting rid of those and replacing them with electric cars, or even better with bikes, will be hugely beneficial. We will create many jobs if we do it right, including in many of the places, particularly in a country like the UK, that are in most need of jobs. High-skilled, renewable, technical and manufacturing jobs can be really good jobs if they're done right. And there's also an aspect of this that I think is perhaps the most intangible, but potentially important, which is, as we've seen over the last few months, being part of a concerted society-wide effort to tackle a problem that's bigger than ourselves is a really powerful motivator and source of reward for a lot of people. And this might not work for everyone, but that you're part of a collective effort where everyone's pulling their weight to tackle climate change is actually, psychological studies show, for many people, the main motivator of doing it. And helping people to feel that they can be part of that is really important. And that takes me to my final point and my opportunity, that whenever I talk to people about climate change, one of the first questions that almost always comes up is, what can I do? How can I be part of it? What's the best way that I can change it in my own life? And now I'm clear that individual action isn't going to save the world, that the world is going to be saved by transformation of the fossil fuel industries, from transformation of land use and so on. And this isn't something an individual can do alone, but individuals can make a difference, and they can signal their political preferences by making a difference, and they can engage with policymakers. Thank you, hope for the future. And that is where people can be a really big part of this. And my kind of framing piece here is, we have a relatively small proportion, about 1 in 5 group of people who are very concerned and willing to take action, and a much larger group of people who are passive, who get that it's a threat but don't think about it much. If those people who are willing to take action, perhaps some of you, can engage policymakers and also their friends, family, people who are in that middle group, and persuade them to move a bit further along the spectrum, then we will very quickly get to a place where it's no longer 2060, but something more like the other way around. And then I think at that point, we really clearly do have an overwhelming majority for action. So that's all I wanted to say. Thank you so much for your time. And I think we do have hopefully some time for questions.
Thank you so much, Leo. That was really, really fascinating, and also very inspiring, actually. Makes me want to go out and do something. We're going to go to questions in a minute. I think Emma's just been monitoring them, but I'll just quickly ask you my question, if that's okay. You talked a lot about the kind of ways in which climate change is communicated, and that these can be problematic, and it can be a barrier to action if you've got polar bears and you've got these far off distant threats. But is it also an issue of literacy? Is it also that people aren't understanding how the science works, and that it is something that can be considered slow moving? Because that's something that I come up against. I just wondered, yeah, what your view on that was.
So it's a really interesting question. I think the traditional answer that someone like me gives to that is, this is the information deficit model. This is the naive interpretation of action on an issue like this. If you give people information, they will act. And I feel like the overwhelming burden or the overwhelming weight of the literature and sort of wisdom of campaign movement is that's not how it works. It's not a matter of just giving people information. And they'll change their behavior. And I mean, look, I'm not going to come and say everyone who's worked on this is wrong. However, I would suggest that what's happened over the last 2 years or so does perhaps slightly turn the argument back a little in the favor of that. I think if you look back to summer, let me get this right, 2018, when the UK and most of Europe and Japan and I think parts of the US had that extraordinarily long running heat wave when it felt like 6 weeks or so, if I remember, where it was sort of above 30 every day. And then we had 3 separate scientific attribution studies that said it was climate change. And then a few months after that, we had the IPCC report on the 1.5 temperature target. And then soon after that, we had Extinction Rebellion and the school strikers breaking out. Then I think that is actually pretty nice evidence that even though the IPCC report, that heat wave, they weren't technically new information. But there is an effect of keeping on saying the same thing and getting people to experience it, and then getting scientists to do it, and then getting some campaigners to talk about it, that they're kind of all saying the same, being said in a few different ways, and being said repeatedly and in a lot of different formats. I think there is something in that. And yeah, that's not to say don't also find creative storytelling ways to do it and do it in lots of different ways. But I wonder whether the information deficit argument has actually been written off too strongly.
Yeah, no, that's really interesting to hear, because we've been having a lot of conversations this week about kind of the different ways that you can communicate the issue. So it's really interesting to hear that viewpoint. Emma, have you been monitoring questions? Hand over to you.
Hi, yes, I have. Thank you for your talk, Leo. It was so interesting. And we've had lots of chat in the chat box and questions beforehand and questions during the talk. So I'm going to start with a question that kind of builds on something that you said during your talk, but also was similar to a couple of questions we received beforehand. As you said in your talk, media outlets are reporting on climate change, but maybe not necessarily in the way that you think it would be most effectively done. And you pointed out some of the ways that we could do that more effectively. The question is, to what extent do you think that all the research on effective framing, such as visuals from work by organisations like Climate Outreach, how much of that is being used to support editorial guidance on communicating climate change?
Yeah, what an interesting question. So Climate Outreach, for anyone who doesn't know, is an organisation that brings together the sort of psychological evidence about climate change and tries to turn it into ways that that people who are concerned about it can talk about it. And they have this project Climate Visuals, where they have a huge bank of images that that is based on their evidence about what's useful. I think I see that being taken up certainly by the media who you'd expect to take it up. So I think The Guardian has taken it up quite well. I think the BBC has to an extent. I think the BBC's environment editors are quite good at understanding this. I think the more conservative media largely hasn't got there yet, because for them it's a win if they talk about climate change, and the visual component of it I think is less on their minds. I guess if I think of kind of the steps that they're all going through, I think where the UK media has got really well in the last couple of years is moving on to now saying, yes, climate change in many cases is a threat to the UK. I think they've still got some way to go, but I think they are much more willing now to talk about heat waves and to talk about flooding in the context of climate change. Sure, they absolutely could do it more, and I don't think many of them have grasped it, but I think that they've moved on further. I think the big gap that they're overwhelmingly not doing is talking about how we can tackle it, how it can be tackled fairly, and what that means for our lives in a positive way. And actually, that's really hard to do with good visuals. I think you can get really good visuals of people's homes being flooded. Heat waves is harder, actually, because when you do visuals of heat waves, then it's really hard not to just have photos of people on the park or send your photographer down to Brighton Beach. But I think that's beginning to change, partly because of the pressure from people like Climate Outreach. But in terms of solutions, I think that's probably the biggest area where UK media needs to improve.
No, that's great. And I think you're totally right about the images that you actually have available to you, because the most dramatic images are those ones of, you know, great floods and great droughts. And if it's, yeah, generally heat waves here are people enjoying the weather, aren't they? So
yeah, so sorry, I know you're about to ask the other question, but I do think actually there is an answer to that, and that is about emergency services. Heat waves, the reason heat wave is a threat for climate change is of people who suffer from the heat, being who are particularly elderly. I mean, essentially it's a lot of the same people who are struggling, who are most vulnerable to coronavirus, that and there isn't a problem with finding images of that.
Well, that goes quite nicely onto a question we've had from Sarah, which is, how can we, I assume we being the public, support and encourage the media to be sharing stories with the type of messaging you've talked about, so the more personal, hopeful, responsible type stories?
Yeah, so I mean, so I guess there's sort of two separate answers to that question. So there are professional organizations who are doing things like that. There's a really nice organization called the New Economy Organizers Network, NEON. Sorry, I know that by the acronym and suddenly didn't remember how it's spelled out. And one of the things that they do is train and put up spokespeople who will talk about with this kind of messaging, and they can be really effective. That isn't quite an answer to the question, how can an ordinary member of the public do it? I think actually newspapers do care about letters that they receive. I think writing letters to the editor is kind of old-fashioned, but I think it is something that they care about. Sharing articles that are the kind that we want, does go down well too. If you have ways of getting them visibly shared so that they get lots of clicks, then that's really helpful. I mean, a lot of this is about scale, that if you're one person acting on your own, then there's only so much you can do. But if you have the ability to get a bunch of people like you to be able to do things, then encouraging good behavior and contacting them when you think that they've done something badly or that they've missed a story. I think newspapers do care what their readers think, and they care about how many clicks they get an article, because in many cases that's how they make their income.
No, completely. And that mirrors really nicely what we had two journalists on our webinar yesterday talking about the need for people to get in touch and say, like, this is a great article, we really want to see more of this, so that they can go to their editor and say, look, people want to hear about this.
Great, I'm relieved I got roughly the right answer.
So slightly different question now from Logan. In your presentation, the line chart showing UK concern about climate change showed there's been a gradual shift from high concern of over 60% in the early noughties, and that slowly declined until after the 2010s. What do you think it was about this period which caused the decline, and how can we ensure there isn't a similar decline now that we've reached a similar high again?
God, I love these questions. Thanks. Okay, so shall I just share my screen quickly just to show which chart we're talking about. So this is Australia, and this is fairly typical. I think other countries had the dip slightly earlier, but essentially it's this dark line that goes down and then comes back up. And it sort of starts dipping around 2006 to 2008 and hits the bottom around 2012 and then starts gradually rebounding. So I think that there were a few things that caused it, and I should be upfront here that this is my speculation, because I don't think anybody has done, and maybe it would be impossible now to test this because it's looking backwards. I think there was a huge amount of media attention on climate change in the mid-2000s, and that pushed it up, possibly artificially, around the time that UK passed the Climate Change Act. It was a really big story at the time. David Cameron went to the Arctic and hugged a husky, and that was seen as an essential thing for a Tory leader to do if they were to have any chance of winning an election, because it was the thing that people cared about. And then the economic crisis came, and climate change stopped being the thing that the media was going to talk about. And a combination of the media getting a bit bored of writing really positive stories about how climate change is positive is not a great word here, but writing accurate stories about how climate change was a big threat and everyone was worried about it, and they wanted a different kind of story. And at the same time, the getting well funded and well organized, and using, for example, a probably Russian hack of scientists' emails that they selectively released, selectively quoted to essentially lie about their contents. And that allowed the media to create a new kind of climate change story, which was partly supposed doubts about climate science, but mostly people think that maybe climate change isn't as bad as it's made out. And that became, I think, self-perpetuating. And for a long time, climate change stories were only, are people now no longer worried about climate change, and there were no longer stories of climate change is really bad. So the second part of the question, the most relevant one here, how do we stop that happening again? Well, part one is going to happen again. We're going to have an economic crash, and it's going to be worse in 2008. And that has already pushed climate change down the news. I think part two probably won't happen again. I think the media now isn't the same as the media was 12 years ago. I think that they no longer, I think journalists themselves are no longer so blasé about climate change. I think that they are going to be less climate denial movement saying this is exaggerated and look how unworried people are. I think they were hoodwinked by it at the time, and I think the growth of fake news and the realization that the climate deniers are essentially funded by fossil fuel industry and have nothing to say will make them far less potent this time. But nonetheless, there will be a challenge that climate change is going to be squeezed out of the news, firstly by the pandemic, which it has been, and then by the economic crisis. Sadly, I don't think it's going to be squeezed quite so much, because the reality of what's going to happen over the next month of climate impacts. Right now, we have a cyclone in the Bay of Bengal, which has been partly worsened by climate change. It's likely that this summer, the US's hurricane season is going to be worse than usual, again, partly driven by climate change. This is going to be the hottest year on record, or at least in the top 3. So there will be a lot of hard news stories that will keep climate change in the news, but it is going to be harder work. I think we've had incredibly positive time of the media for the last year and a half, and that has really helped drive climate action. I think everything I talked about from summer 2018 was a major factor in getting the UK to pass its Net Zero Act, and other countries have followed. The media environment will be harder now, and it is going to take people who are worried about climate change to really push hard to keep it in the news. So, sorry, that's not maybe not the most uplifting answer, but I think in some ways it's going to be as hard as 2007, 2008. In some ways it won't be, and I think we see it coming, and we can do things about it.
That's great, thank you. Kind of sticking with the theme of other major news stories and how climate change is competing, or how it can be talked about within those. We've had a couple of questions about coverage of coronavirus and climate change, so I'll just take 2 as we're short on time and put them together. So we've got one from Claire that is, how is coronavirus affecting public concern and reporting about climate change? And then one from Kit that is, how should we constructively challenge media talk that assumes that levels of flying or car sales should get back to normal and grow post-COVID?
Yeah, so I think media coverage has changed, like it squeezed out everything else, but perhaps actually slightly less than you might expect. So yesterday there was a study about the fall in emissions that did really well globally. It was one of the big stories of the day. Last week there was this study that I referenced about conditions as hot as the Sahara, which had no coronavirus link whatsoever, and again did really well. It was one of the big stories of the day in a similar way as I think it would have been last year. So there is still some space. I think smaller stories that would have got into the news before are now not getting in, and that's going to carry on being a challenge. And I think that comes back to the answer that the journalist gave, which I think was the best way of putting it, of contacting with positive stories and asking why the media isn't covering smaller stories is definitely a thing journalists interested in. The new normal side of it, I think, it's a battle. And I think it's a battle that is going to have a lot of different fronts to it. I think there is no single answer. I don't think that there is a simple assumption that everyone definitely wants things to get back to normal. I think countries that are bailing out their airlines, including the UK, are saying that they want them to deal with their emissions. So I think there is, at least for now, an established view, obviously not the US, but there is an established view that things can't go back to exactly as normal, but that will have to be reinforced all the time. And people who care about it need to keep on talking about it and talking to politicians. Again, thank you, Hope for the Future, that this is, exactly the kind of stuff that politicians need to be hearing, that thinking that the only thing their public care about is getting jobs back at all costs and getting the economy growing again at all costs, but people also want the recovery to be done in a climate friendly way. Otherwise, we're going to be back in crises that look pretty similar to this, but are longer lasting and potentially more severe.
Thanks, Leo. That's great. I think that's all the time we've got for questions, but your final answer did lead quite nicely onto our talk for tomorrow as well. So George can tell you a bit more about what's coming up on the last day.
Thank you so much, Leo. That was really interesting. And thank you for all of our attendees for your brilliant questions. Thanks again to ECF and Gower Street for funding us and allowing us to be able to put events on like this on. Yeah, so you can join us tomorrow for part 4, the final instalment, where the Hope of the Future team will be discussing how you can use the media to lobby your MP with our communications and media training. And a lot of it will be touching on the things we've discussed this week, as well as some really great practical advice about how you can kind of get involved, basically. Please do take time to fill out the feedback form that should, with any luck, pop up when we end the meeting. And I hope you all enjoyed it. And thank you so much again for coming, and for Leo for taking the time. Cheers.